So I work for Sustainable Northwest, based in Portland, Oregon. We are a regional intermediary organization that works in partnerships with communities across a lot of the West, primarily focused in Oregon since that's our home, but we do work in Northern California all the way up into Idaho in certain places. In our forest programs, we do have a ranching program that's worked almost primarily exclusively in the Klamath Basin, which is in Southwest Oregon and Northern California, and has done some other ranch-related work, ranching work, more broad across the West. And I don't know when my phone's ringing. Turn that off. I had it up here for a time thing, and so I apologize about that. As we get going here, where was I going with this talk? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our work. Darren also, when he contacted me about this, asked me to ground the... oh, no. I can talk off of that screen. Okay. So he asked me to ground this a little bit in some projects that are actually happening on the ground. And I'm going to talk about 2 projects in Oregon, 2 biomass energy projects that are moving forward, both mostly sourced off of federal forest land. While she's working on getting that up, we'll just continue. So our principles at Sustainable Northwest, just to ground you of who we are as an organization, we support and we promote collaboration and community-based solutions to the approaches that are facing the West. And so Mary's discussion this morning on collaboration hits home. It was great to hear a lot of what she had to say, because it's a lot of what we do in our daily jobs as well. We also promote business models that are appropriately scaled and that support a growing national, regional, and local green economy. We're a big networking organization. We connect people with ideas, with each other, hopefully in order to foster innovation in the place, but also to spread that innovation across different places and different communities throughout the West. And then we have a pretty robust policy program that's focused mostly at the federal level. The Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition is the keystone of that program. Because we're working in federally dominated landscapes, we have to be interested in what the federal government's doing with their dollars and with their resources if we're going to have opportunities on the ground in our local community. I mentioned what do we do, so this is our programs of work. I kind of ran through all of these except for the bottom one here, Sustainable Northwest Wood. It's a for-profit subsidiary that we opened in November of 2008. It does wood distribution in the Portland area, buys from a lot of our rural community partners, and sources that into the green building markets in Seattle and Portland in particular. November of 2008 was the best time in the history of the world to open a wood products business, right? Well, I'm happy to say that the last 6 months they have been profitable on a monthly basis and are moving towards recouping the initial capital that went into that business. We could talk more about that later. Our path to woody biomass, how do we get here? I said we're about collaboration, we're about community-based solutions. It starts with collaboration. I have to go back to that. Mostly around federal forest. I think the graphic was thrown up yesterday that Oregon is 54%, I think, owned by the federal government. If you get east of the Cascades, that number jumps over 60% pretty quickly. Some of the communities that we work with down in Northern California are over 90% owned by the federal government. So we have to figure out how to work with those federal resources. And as Mary quite eloquently talked about this morning, collaboration is the way of the future. It's the way of the present to get there. There's a lot of common ground around restoration, particularly these dry forest types, where fire exclusion has had a tremendous impact. We also realized early on, with some of our partners kind of encouraging us, that we need some way to market this material, that the traditional wood products industry doesn't want this small diameter stuff that has that folks think needs to come out of these stands. And so we created something called the HFHC Partnership, which is the Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities Partnership, which largely was a consortium of businesses trying to start a new kind of forest product sector in their local communities. That has led to the creation of Sustainable Northwest Wood. We were doing a lot of market connections, market development in partnership with those businesses, but realizing that those market connections were resulting in about 3 to 4% of closures on deals, not a very high success rate. The wood distribution centers allowed us to be much more effective. But still, there was smaller diameter stuff and tops and slash. What are we going to do with this mess? It costs us a lot of money to deal with it. There's all kind of environmental degradation associated with leaving it on site, blah, blah, blah. So we said, okay, we have to start looking at this. Energy is what was the topic of the day. It also kind of tiered into something that we've been promoting for a while in terms of an integrated utilization model, which we feel is critical in these restoration kind of activities to economic viability of these forest enterprises and kind of getting restoration dollars back on the ground. And that's where I'm going to end my talk. And then from exploring energy and crawling down in that rabbit hole, we got farther down the rabbit hole and realized that the highest and best use and most near-term opportunities we have in these communities are to prioritize these thermal energy uses of wood, particularly in the communities where we don't have access to natural gas, which is very common throughout most of our West. But to start at a higher level, because I am going to talk a little bit more about the energy side of the equation today, we've talked a lot about this. Our national energy consumption is roughly one-third, one-third, one-third electricity, transportation, and the old thermal energy friend down here on the bottom. However, the white letters represent things in play at the federal level, and the things in the black are mostly at the state level. Again, me thinking Oregon here, but most states in the West have an RPS, as was pointed out yesterday. So there's been discussion about various different RPS, RES, CES at the federal level. None of that's come into play yet, but there are some production tax credits and investment tax credits to drive this electricity piece forward. And this is not just specific to wood, but just in terms of national energy policy. We have a renewable fuel standard at the national level. In Oregon, we have a renewable fuel standard of our own, and we have a low carbon fuel standard as well. Again, policy mechanisms to help drive us towards a more renewable energy future in those two energy sectors. And I can hit the button again, and nothing's going to pop up down here in the bottom third. Folks have said that's not quite right. There are some combined heat and power things and the investment tax credit in particular at the federal level. However, those are more focused on getting the electricity on the ground. It's not specific to district energy or to heat-led combined heat and power, although there are some interest in moving that forward. I would say, however, this third piece is starting to be realized. So we've talked about it a lot at this conference. Organizations like RVCC, BTEC, the Biomass Thermal Energy Council, and others are promoting this on the Hill. And I think there is a large recognition that this sector is missing in terms of our energy policy in the country. Nobody's ready to do anything about it, but I think people have realized it. I mean, Biomass Magazine even changed the name of the magazine to Biomass Power and Thermal, right? So there's even a lot of movement in terms of where is this going to go from here. I don't need to spend a lot of time on talking about why. I mean, I think Dr. O'Loughlin talked about this yesterday, that when you, on the left side of the graph, we're focusing on these heat kind of systems, whether they're heat only or thermal only, versus getting more into the combined heat and power. And these percentages are relatively relative, but we're trying to focus our, maximizing energy output from the resource that we have. Not only does that make sense from a conservation perspective, but it also makes sense from an economics perspective. The more energy you have to sell, probably the more dollars you're going to have in your system. We don't have fuels for schools in Region 6 or Region 5. You do in Region 1. Bless your souls. We realized this tremendous success that was happening in Montana and also in Vermont, where some folks were leading these kind of fuels for schools efforts. And so we partnered with some other regional intermediaries of our own that we work with closely on the ground and said, we got to make this happen here. We called the Forest Service and they said, we can't do anything over there. So we had to make these happen. The Enterprise School in Enterprise, Oregon was the first woody biomass-fired boiler in the state in over 50 years, a new wood-fired modern, completely a community-driven process. No help really from anybody outside of Wallowa County. That project's coming on to its third heating year, and over the first 2 years has saved, the guaranteed energy savings are $83,000 a year. I think the realized energy savings due to some complications in contracting are just above 80, but it's still a very significant number when you're talking about a really small school district. The Blue Mountain Hospital is a project that we were involved in a little bit more, but it's, as you can tell, it's a pellet boiler versus a wood chip boiler in Enterprise, saving somewhere around $55,000 a year going into its actually will go into its first heating season this year. We've been successful in working with our Department of Energy at the state level to actually steer some ARRA dollars, some stimulus dollars into these projects. This project went online in 2008, I believe, the Enterprise project. Through this heating season, we're going to have 10 systems in place in Oregon, mostly capitalized with some of that stimulus money and some other energy efficiency policies that were in play at the state. So we're making some significant progress at the institutional level kind of going forward, and there's at least 10 more projects that are at some level of way past feasibility, trying to find financing, or going through to construction. I was supposed to talk a little bit about ecological implications. Sustainable Northwest does that primarily through collaboration, realizing that what shakes out of the system, particularly on federal forest lands, comes out as a result of a collaborative process. And that's where we kind of start we don't necessarily go around and define necessarily ecological significant areas. There are plenty of organizations that do that, and we do that in partnership with those organizations and with community folks. But however, I did want to just quickly mention, Dr. Laughlin talked a little bit about the 16 federal definitions. Within our policy work, we have tried to engage in this debate a lot. It comes down, in my mind, to what is biologically a definition of biomass. I think there's no doubt what that is. In terms of the energy policy, though, that's going on, the ecologically appropriate / sustainable is what they're trying to define, and that's why each of those policies is a different outcome, and that's why there's 16 different definitions. Even if we go to one biomass definition, I think what you will see is you then will see what the sustainability criteria are going to be in the context of those policies. So I don't know that one Farm Bill type definition will completely satisfy the problem. I think that folks will still have that concern, particularly as it relates to federal lands, about how do we know that this material is renewable, sustainable, ecologically appropriate over time. As we thought about this, on federal land, there's NIFMA, there's NEPA, and then there's collaboration. There's a lot of things at play across the national forest system, whether you're in Oregon or you're in North Carolina, to ensure some of that sustainability criteria is helping to move forward. There is some concern from some of the environmental community that's beyond the scope of what they feel like these three pieces ensure. However, I think some of that is amenable. We can get past that over time. The question I have is on private land, and that there are significant regional differences. As somebody who used to work for a big forest products company in Alabama and managed timberland versus what folks do in Oregon, it's very, very, very different. And I'm sure it's very different here in Utah and other places of the West. There's significant regional differences. There's things in play at the state level, and in fact, that's probably where a lot of these things are meant to be implemented. But Oregon has a Forest Management Act. It's not as strict as what is in California, right? Most of the South has voluntary best management practices. So how do you create that level playing field across the country when, one, there's very different ways that each state deals with it, but two, there are very significant ecological differences across those different things. So people have thrown out ideas like biomass harvesting guidelines. The Forest Guild is working on some kind of regionally specific biomass harvesting guidelines. They've completed one for the Northeast. I think they're finished in the Southeast, and I'm trying to encourage my colleague Mike DeBonis to come to the Northwest. We need your biomass harvesting guidelines. Stewardship plans are in place in a lot of the NRCS programs and different things, and a lot of people have talked about third-party certification as a way to think about these. I'm not putting these up here as the way. I'm just trying to think about how can you kind of create something that's across the board, like NIFMA, NEPA, that recognizes those ecological differences across the concern. My concern is that if we have a completely wide open definition, we will have, it may impact our opportunity in the West, because if you have to deal with the federal government over supply versus you can go to the Southeast where there's complete wide open voluntary best management practices, I know where I would go if I had some money to invest, although I'd want to live out here. So I need to fasten this, speeding this up, which is always my problem. And so I'm going to kind of go over this. I think we've talked about this conference of what some of the benefits of thermal are. And I think what we notice it mostly is that it's scaled with this need for stewardship. As Mary mentioned this morning, a lot of these collaborative projects start small and build. And that's the way we think this energy part can build out as well. This biomass can build out as well. It can grow right along with those collaborative efforts as they go forward and go up. Quickly on two projects that are happening in Oregon. The Malheur Lumber facility is a new joint venture between an existing 30-year-old lumber company and a few actually old existing wood pellet folks as well. This project was capitalized again through stimulus dollars, but created 15 new jobs in this community. 15 new jobs doesn't sound like a whole lot in Portland or Washington, D.C., that's 6% of the non-farm workforce that lives in that county. This is in a county with 17% unemployment. It's a big deal, and even bigger of the 75 that we're going to retain at the sawmill. They need 40,000 new tons of supply. That's coming off of the collaborative efforts of the Blue Mountain Forest Partners. Basically, the Blue Mountain Forest Partners have said, we think this much ground needs to be treated. They've done some analysis. We think this amount of material is available. There is no guaranteed contract for supply between the Forest Service and the private entity. There is belief and trust in this collaborative effort that they're going to get that on an annual basis. That's a pretty significant outcome. The energy output, it's all about pellets and bricks. They're exploring some potential CHP, new steam systems, blah, 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 but that 40,000 tons is going to produce that equivalent of BTUs. It's about 18 megawatts of power equivalent if you do the evaluation, and it's going to reduce energy costs, not at the facility, but at these institutional kind of projects across the region and across the state by $4 to $5 million a year, which is a pretty significant number. If we only make power out of that, we generate much less total energy, and we're not necessarily guaranteed in Oregon to displace fossil fuels. A lot of our power actually comes from the Columbia River. A few pictures of the plant, just so that my talk doesn't have complete just words. This woman up in the top right corner, I had the opportunity to take her to John Day, Oregon. She is, this is Nancy Sutley, the head of the Council on Environmental Quality, so the President's chief environmental advisor on all things energy and environmental. And so there she is, being fascinated by a new way to talk about biomass energy in the country. And she was like, this is groundbreaking for me. I've never heard about this. And it was a very unique opportunity not only to talk to her about that, but to have someone that high level in administration in that rural of a place that relied that much on the federal government for their opportunity. Very similar project out in, well, not necessarily similar project out in Wallowa County. This is in the same county where the Enterprise School is. This is an integrated campus. That John Day project had an existing sawmill. This place has nothing, nothing. And so how do you start from scratch, basically? And the idea here is it started around a post and pole operation that was initially a for-profit subsidiary of Wallowa Resources, another nonprofit, but has been added to. We're not talking about a tiny operation here. They're going to buy 100,000 tons of wood in 2012, and this is moving forward. The unique thing here is a unique private-public ownership where the private companies are going to form an LLC, but Wallowa Resources, the nonprofit, is going to be an equity partner, and the county's actually going to own the ground, right? So in a lot of these really resource-dependent communities, counties are having trouble funding county services. And so the county has said, we can buy this piece of property and create a different revenue stream for ourselves over time as we rent that property out to these facilities. It also creates stability of ownership of that piece of ground for these smaller businesses, which is the problem across much of, at least where we work. This is kind of a brief schematic of what they're doing. I've got a 0.5 megawatt downdraft gasifier here. It's actually a 100 kW system what they're putting in. But the primary is going to be a net metered project that basically provides heat through a firewood line and a briquette line, and then obviously uses a little bit of power on site, but they're going to be buying power off the grid because at that level they can't generate enough power for the whole thing. What does the future energy sector look like? Well, this is my ideas. Institutional heat projects, but are they going to get to the scale that we need in terms of helping us with our restoration goals? So the next step up is these kind of heat-led CHP projects, like what's happening in Wallowa County. And then bringing over some European technology, or maybe not even European technology, since the University of Idaho is doing it, the city of Minneapolis is doing district energy, but for some reason we always think of Europe when we think of district energy. It's happening in this state. President Carter had a huge report written in the late 60s, early 70s. When was President Carter in office? Before I was born. Okay, President Carter, peanut farmer, had a district energy plan put in place. It's never been updated. It's never been updated. So the Congressional Research Service, hopefully, we've encouraged them, let's update that report and look at what the opportunities are across the country. Getting to scale requires significant opportunities. We've heard a lot of criticism. It's going to take more than schools to help us take care of the restoration problem. And so that's why we've started to think about what are the process heat opportunities that are really good fits for rural communities. We use a lot of heat in Oregon for seafood preparation, for food packaging, for I've heard for peeling potatoes. We don't do as much of that in Oregon, but I think you do a lot of it in Idaho. Greenhouses, nurseries, what else is out there? So we're going to do a pretty comprehensive analysis of what kind of low temperature heat opportunities are there in terms of recruiting new industries into Oregon and into different parts of the West for cheap heat. Why does this matter from a forest restoration perspective? This is just a quick, big assumption-driven analysis to say if we take, and this is sorry, it's based on some Oregon numbers, but there's a total supply of 1.5 million bone dry tons per year using an analysis done by the Oregon Forest Research Institute. So I just took that number and said we could do 25 megawatt plants with it. We could do all heat-led kind of CHP projects. We could do all schools. What does that look like when you kind of throw it out there? We would have to have 600 schools. I don't know if we have 600 schools in Oregon. So that might not be the exact thing, but just to do an apples to apples or apples to oranges, if you watched the debate last night, comparison across the way. What matters is because the heat is so valuable, you can actually pay more for that material. So you see $60 a bone dry ton and $80 a bone dry ton here. And that helps drive the rest of the analysis. So if we could change those numbers if folks want to argue with them. But look at the value in terms of the feedstock value going back into the state's economy or even into the local economy. And then if you divide that value by numbers of acres, by $350 of treatment cost per acre, we're actually going to be able to get a lot more. Well, we get a different number. I shouldn't say a lot more. We get a different number of potential acres treated kind of going forward. So I said we don't have 600 schools. We're probably not going to develop 30 CHP plants. We're not going to build 6 25 megawatt plants, in all honesty. So what is that? What could it really look like? This is Chad's crazy ideas. This is me trying to be a little bit provocative. But let's throw up a theoretical mix. There are some existing biopower facilities in the state. We could potentially get to 20 schools. We've got about 10 now. We can maybe do a few downtown districts. We might be able to do a few completely process heat users. Okay, so what does this all mean? When you look at using the same assumptions from the back, what we're talking about is a total of $107 million annually into the budget, both from the feedstock value going back, whether that's used on public ground to do restoration, or it helps keep private landowners in the forestry business. But the energy savings number is significant as well, because in most of these places we will be displacing propane or heating oil, because there's really no natural gas east of the Cascades. So it's not just a northeastern issue. Interestingly enough, our state budget fall is $140 million. That's not bad by doing one little strategy. So I'm trying to convince the governor of that as well. The secret sauce. We've been talking about business planning, and our consultants using a secret sauce thing, so I said, what the hell, we'll use that too. So there's your curse word for the video. Ecological collaboration sets the table. Collaboration tells us what we're going to do. It kind of helps us define what that supply number looks like, what that supply basket potential is. Biologically available, economically available, socially available. We better be shooting for that bottom number to begin with. The revenue from a lot of this utilization can help fund holistic restoration. Through a stewardship contracting mechanism, we can do riparian area improvements. We can do aspen revitalization projects. We have to have revenue, but this biomass revenue can help generate some of that more holistic reservation. Economical, I've mentioned integrated utilization. It maximizes utilization, maxes value by focusing on heat-led energy. And then our social components here are equitable access to opportunity and capture that wealth as locally as possible. These smaller facilities can be and are being capitalized, invested in, and funded in, either in part or in whole, by local folks and local entities, which helps maintain profit, reduces energy costs, and makes a big difference, we hope, across the landscape. Lastly, our RVCC, there's the save the date. Come join us. It's the most fun you will ever have in a policy context. I guarantee you that. It's not just idiots like me. It's actually real rural folks from around the West deciding what the policy priorities of the organization should be. We usually host it at McMiniman's. There's tons of beer and house-made whiskey available. I'm telling you, it's a lot of fun. And I think that's it.